Mhm.
Well, welcome. Nice little chime there if you caught that. Welcome to Legends of the Wind. I'm Jurri Schenck.
And I am Alicia Choi.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for joining us tonight. Legends of the Wind is a place where you can find your own story, where you can discover what story you're in. And we call it what's becoming a legend, where you get to learn about your life from the viewpoint of storytelling. And not only like from a story that's already been written, you have the opportunity here to have a unique story that's never been seen or heard before for you that will touch your heart. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. Tonight's show, we're going to be dealing with a story called The Kingdom of Two Wells. And we're going to be talking about what it means to think mythically and how to interpret that story. So, a question that we have for you to be thinking about is, what do you do when you feel stuck and ashamed? Now, we also are going to be reading that story, The Kingdom of Two Wells, from this book, Legends of the Wind, Volume 1. And for those of you who have purchased it, thank you so much for buying our book. And if you have bought our book, please consider writing a review on Amazon. We would love to hear your comments and feedback, and also give you a chance to communicate to other people who might be buying a book why it's so valuable. And today, we talk about Alicia's illustration. So Alicia did the illustration for the story called The Fire Bear. I love this picture because it's so rich in color and everything. And so we want to welcome you to the show. So, Alicia, thank you so much for painting this. She is the backbone of this show. We couldn't do it without her. Even though I write the stories, there's no way at all I could do this without her. So, thank you.
You're welcome.
So, in last week's episode, we did a show about Alicia's story called A Diamond in the Rough. Now, you've had a week to process it. We talked about it on the last show. Is there anything that you feel about that story in the past week or so?
Uh, well, that I've been interested in so many different things that can be facets of the diamonds.
Mm-hmm.
And in the beginning, it was rough, and then at the end of the story, it's like shiny, you know,
And cut.
yeah, and cut
Mm-hmm.
nicely. So since I'm still doing so many things at the same time, that I try to focus only one thing, and I actually gave up on only doing one thing, and then I actually feel better.
Oh, good.
Yeah, because it's kind of battle for me to figure out to just focusing one thing is not working, and
Mm.
it's okay. Yeah, it's okay. I do many things, and then the good thing is that I'm not gonna get bored out of just doing one thing. So it's okay. So that's the maybe the I can tell you one more thing about the
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
The all the the facets of the diamonds that I mean,
Is
yeah.
the dragon still chasing you?
Oh no. No, of course,
Good.
yeah. So I already passed that story, but then I was kind of in between, and I picking a few things that I want to do, and then I try to focus on one thing, but then I keep adding stuff, and then realize that probably just me that doing many things at the same time. So it's
Sure.
okay, yeah. Hmm.
So, for those of you in the audience, we have a promotion we're going to talk about after we go through the story and some Q&A. But one of the things is that the story "A Diamond in the Rough" that I delivered last week it was for Alicia, and I didn't prepare anything. I didn't interview her. Even though I know her, of course, but it's meant for spontaneous inspiration. And you have that opportunity as well. We'll talk more about that after the story that we're of the Kingdom of Two Wells, and also the Q&A. So one of the things about Alicia's ability is she has a great ability of design. So she did the illustration. So this is from a promotion that we did this March and February, and we have the different kinds of storybook cover illustrations. And I'll let you look closely here at one of them, the one I just showed at the beginning. That was for the story called Farther Away. And so she's super talented. And so she likes to take my stories that I write for actual people and do those illustrations. Now, Let's talk about the kingdom of two wells. The kingdom of two wells. It connects with a question. What do you do when you feel stuck and ashamed? And the story is a fable. It's a parable. It's a thing, a tale to be learned from and to dive into. And we'll explain that here. So without any further ado, let me just read this story from our book. The Kingdom of Two Wells. Out in the desert, on a great journey, a man and his camel traveled upon the sands. The desert had many dunes, and the sun beat down on the man's hardened soul. For many miles and many days he sought the horizon, but he could never reach it. Inside his soul was dying and was heavy with thirst. Some time later, the man and his camel came alongside a large caravan of travelers. They played their musical instruments and sang aloud. He thought they were a mysterious troop, and he wondered, could they be good? Could they be light? Could they bring me delight? He thought about their strange ways and traveled with them for a jaunt, which led to the sunset and the day's end. For now there were fires in the sky, or fires that were lit up in the night sky as they camped under the moon and played their songs. The din and the dance whirled around the man as he sat dizzily with amazement. At camp in the pit, the very deep pit, was delicious and delectable delights of meats from wild animals from far-off lands. The band of travelers danced, sang, and tripped out around and about in the sands. They leaped into the air, for they sought the delight of the darkness, and even shunned the moon and her faint light. The man ate and ate, and then he ate some more. And the more he ate of the wild meats he ate, the deeper the pit in his stomach became. It was delightful for a season, but this constant barrage of sound, smell, and sight sickened his heart. He thought he knew the voice and the language of the travelers. He thought he could teach them his native tongue, but they sought to teach him their tongue. It was difficult for him, yet still tried to share the tongue of his former land. They couldn't hear, and they shouted and laughed into the darkness, for their ears could not understand. An hardly traveler handed the man a piece of meat. "Take this, my son, and I will give you your desires. Only just let me have some gold from your pocket, and I will give you more." The man took the meat and paid the price with his gold and dropped it into the hands of the traveler. He leaped up into the air and took the gold and shouted and spit on it, and then dropped it to the earth and spat on it again. He danced and danced in circles over the gold and ran away into the darkness, laughing hysterically. Yet the sad man ate his rotten meat. He fell asleep at night and awoke hours later. The fire pit had just a few coals burning, and it was dark. The moon had sunk and the sun wasn't up. It was the darkest of nights, and to his surprise, the travelers had vanished. "Where are my friends?" he asked, and he looked around. As he got up from the desert floor, he tried to stand and saw that the ropes bound his feet and both his robe and shirt, the ones his father gave him. That someone had stripped them from his body and torn them to shreds around him. Inside, his heart broke and cried out, for there was a deeper issue at hand. All he owned were his pants, belt, and the rope around his feet. His hands were free, but the knot on the rope was too great to untie. How could he move? How could he walk? What could he do? His hands could work and produce, but he could not walk. He looked around for a dagger or sword, something sharp with an edge to cut the ropes, but there was none. Frustrated and resigned, he laid back down on his back and stared up into the sky, into the darkness. As he cried deep tears, the wound inside of him surfaced. Inside of him came a lie and a covenant. Inside of him was the agreement of the pain that his past produced. Inside of him was the son, the little boy, that child that said, "I cannot do this, for I despise myself. I am nothing and always will be." The man rolled on his side and sobbed. His heart was breaking, but here was the revealing sight. His tears stung his eyes, and the piercing echo of the past rang true in his soul. Here was the pain, but what could he do with it? He rolled onto his back and looked up into the sky. Up until now, he could not see the stars, but now at last he could perceive them. The stars sparkled and twinkled and shined in the night. He stared and marveled at them. Could these be the ones of the midnight sky who guided sailors on the high seas? Could these be the ones that determined the destination in the darkness? What marvelous insight they bring! How wonderful that there is a way to walk in the shadows of life. Amazing, he thought. He looked out at the nights and noticed the patterns and constellations. Then he remembered the stories and characters of the constellations. The words of the stars spoke with deep wisdom. One star burst into bright light. In fact, it was staggering as the incredible pinpoint of light broke through the darkness. The light made a star-crossed image and seemed to point down to the horizon, or off into the distance, as if it was a guiding light that leads us to a Savior. The man sat up and saw the sign. A small glimmer of hope rose within him. Something divine was happening. Something special was taking place. The man hopped up onto his feet, even though the rope was still bound him. The man shouted to the sky, "Help! Can somebody help me? I am lost, and the travelers have left me alone, robbed and broke. Help!" Even though there was a sign of hope inside his heart, he still felt alone. A small noise came off in the distance behind him. The man turned around and looked. About a half-mile away there were 3 camels that rode at a persistent speed, and they were coming toward him. The men of these camels had lamps that ditched their pathway, that guided their pathway so they may not stumble or fall into a ditch. More hope rose inside the man's heart. "Hey, you! Can you see me? Do you know where I am? Help!" The three camels and their men approached the man bound by the feet. The man looked up at these 3. Now, the 3 before him wore crowns on their heads and had beards. Robes of satin and purple cloth adorned them. Jewels and gold sparkled on their cloaks. The camels, too, had rings of gold and silver in their snouts and ears. Here was royalty, and the man knew it. He dropped to his knees and bowed low. "Arise, my son," said the one closest to him. The man stood up, and tears filled his eyes. Shame and hope mixed and spun inside of his heart. He might meet his death soon. The king spoke. "You seem lost. What are you doing here in the desert, and where is your camel?" The man looked around and saw he was nothing. Bankrupt. I don't know. I met the travelers and ate their meat. It was good for a time, and I loved their music, but it was an awful noise. They robbed me of all that I have." The king looked at the man, shirtless, dirty, broken down, and bound at the feet. And yet he loved him. The king replied, "But you have your hands. What are you doing with them?" The man said, "I have tried and tried to free myself, but I cannot walk. Now I am stuck and am hungry and very thirsty." The king paused and stepped off his camel. His robe flowed around him, and the gold sparkled and glistened in the starlight. The man couldn't see his face, but a dim glow of blue light came from the king's countenance. The king pulled out a dagger in a flash. "This won't hurt," he said. And the king stooped down and cut off the ropes between the man's feet. The man danced in delight and was free to move around. The king asked him, "So, my son, where do you want to go? You have a long journey ahead of you. You might need some water. Here, fill yourself up." The king took from one of his companion's camels a wineskin, but it was empty. The man asked, "Where can I get water? This is the desert. There is nothing here." "You may have been eating bitter meat, my son, but there are in fact 2 wells here in the desert. Come with me." And the king led the son out into the valley. The moon rose off into the horizon, and it seemed bigger than normal. Its light poured out over the land of the desert, and the king led his son forward. The 2 companions of the king rode their camels and followed them. In a short distance, the king and the son came to 2 different wells in the desert. The king dropped a container into one well, and they could hear it fall far below and splash down. The water was very far away. After a moment, the king pulled up the container and produced the water. "Here," he said as he handed him a drink. The man stepped up and drank. The taste was bitter and horrible in his mouth. He spat it out and choked, almost vomiting. "What?" he said. "How can this be? This is the worst water I have ever tasted. I feel like death has gripped me." The king threw the container to the ground and walked over to the other well. Again he took a new container and dropped it down. They heard a splash as if the water was much closer to the surface, and then the king drew out its water. He offered it to the son, but the son was cautious, for he felt unsure and unable to trust the king. "Please, take it," said the king. The man stepped forward and took a sip. "Oh my!" he cried out. "Oh my!" he cried. He took another sip, and then another, and yet another. He drank deep of this water. "It tastes so good, so sweet, so wonderful. How could I have ever missed this? How could I have ever missed this water?" The king said, "My son, there are 2 wells in my kingdom. You choose which one to drink. This is my promise to you. If you drink of the sweet well, you will never thirst again. I have come in the middle of the night to give you back more than what you have lost." Now with that, the other 2 companions stepped off their camels and produced a royal robe and a crown with a single jewel into it, and placed it on the son's head. Then they wrapped the robe around him. Next they washed the son's feet and removed his shame and placed beautiful slippers on them encrusted with jewels. The generosity of the king overwhelmed the son. "How could he have done this for me? Why?" The king replied, "But every day with me is Christmas. You saw my star in the night sky, didn't you? But you heard me coming from behind you. I have hemmed you in, and you are mine." The king took his son's face into his hands and drew him close. The king smiled big and laughed. The light was all over his face, and he kissed his son on the forehead. "Stay away from the travelers," he whispered. And with that, the king, his 2 companions, and their camels vanished before his eyes. The son still held the container of the sweet well, and he drank more. The love and life filled him, and he continued to drink. In fact, it was such sweetness that joy filled his soul, and soon he fell asleep. That night the son slept deep, and the dreams that passed through his mind were images of life and hope. He woke in the next morning to a beautiful sunrise. His camel returned and stood next to him, and a small fire and coals and bread rested next to him. It was breakfast time. He ate his fill and mounted his camel. He looked out at the horizon and saw that he was about to leave the valley, and he went on his way again. This time he carried the sweet water and no longer drank from the well of bitterness. And from there he returned to his journey. Inceptio. So that's a pretty involved, detailed story. A lot of things that we can talk about there. So I understand that you and I talked about this before. What do you think about the story?
Oh, it's a nice story. Well, the stories you write, the one thing I like about is the ending is always good. With a good ending. So, and then it's hopeful. So the man went through stuff, but in the end, he got all the food back or camel back, and his hope back and journey back. So I like the story.
Cool, thanks. So we're gonna do a little Q&A here, and kind of freestyle our questions and answers. But Alicia's got some things that she wanted to ask me about it, so that we can together unpack it.
Yeah. And then, can you talk about how you interpret the story, like this particular one?
Right. So the way I look at interpreting a story is a similar way you would interpret a dream. It would be what we call function versus form. And so in dreams, you look at a dream from the ideas and the images as a function. And that way you can learn more about it. It's not necessarily what's apparently on the surface, but what is the elements and how do they function in that story. So like if you have a dream about a car is, you have a car, but it represents your career, your destiny, your whatever you're doing in life as a job or a ministry, for example. And it's depending on the situation in the dream, that's what your life is doing. And so I also want to go back to one of the questions you asked, who the story's for. The story wasn't just for my friend Niles. This story is for people who are dealing with shame. They're dealing with bondage or even an addiction of some kind. And so you have a loss of hope. And how do you get free from what you're stuck in? And so when it comes to interpreting this story, let's go ahead and look at how different parts of this story and what they mean in their function. And also, this is the same way of what we talk about thinking mythically. How you look at a story or a movie or a song and you go, what is this telling me? What is my life interpretation in this piece of art or writing or music? And it's valuable because if you can see yourself in someone's story or in your own story, then you can be able to process and think about your life. Alisha told me about this thing called cognitive. What's it called?
Oh, metacognition.
Metacognition. Thinking about thinking or being aware of what you're learning. So when you're reading a story or watching a movie or listening to a song, you use metacognition. You're becoming aware of yourself in the story. Yeah.
Yeah, well, in that sense, I've been telling you the biography is really good, especially the ones who passed away long time ago, those scientists or artists and all those people.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. So the story is mainly when you hear it, but it can interpret to whatever situation you're in, so you can get anything out of it. And then I believe everybody will learn different things from the same story.
Sure, absolutely.
So, who's the man in the story?
The man in this story is this person suffering from some sort of shame issue, and gets stuck in it and does not know the way out of it. Yeah.
The next question is the one that I actually really wanted to ask. Who are the travelers?
The travelers are the function. And what do? They give you this meat, right? This delicious foreign meat. And they take your gold in exchange for it. And I think the travelers represent the method of addiction or the method of shame. They're the ones that provide the alcohol or the drugs or whatever the message is that says you need this material or you need this mentality or mindset that you think it's rewarding, but it robs you. And the travelers could be an actual person in your life. It could be an addiction, I guess. And yeah.
So it's just the addiction and those stuff, or certain people group, or
Sure. It could be the people that you think they're your friend, but the fruit of the relationship is destructive, or brings bondage, or unhealthy lifestyles. And I think that they talk about you are who the company you keep, and if you don't have good company, you're going to be transformed into their mentality and their belief system. And if that company has some toxic things going on, it's not healthy for you, and it won't end well. But there is hope in this story, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. So why were the man's feet tied but not his hands?
I thought about that question. So he couldn't walk, but he could do things with his hands. But yet he couldn't untie the knot. And I think that when you're in shame, you're limited in your walk in life. You have you're defeated. But you have hands, and you think you can do things, but it's kind of fruitless. And the hands represent the effort to try to free yourself. Unfortunately, the knot is too tight.
Okay. So, can you talk about how lost man feels?
Well,
You kind of mentioned it before,
Yeah.
but yeah.
So when it comes to bondage or shame and the need of freedom, and you know you need freedom, but you don't know how to. It feels hopeless, and it's a situation where you don't know what to do, and you don't know who to turn to, or what method to take your way out. I know for some people who are alcoholics, um, sometimes they reach the precipice of their situation, and they're like, I'm not going to drink anymore, and so they can join a 12-step recovery program, for example. But there has to be this point of no return where you feel so lost and so helpless that you want to see a change, and you have to be set free. And that lost feeling is absolute desperation. And sometimes it's in cycles. You get more and more lost, but it isn't until that final point where hopefully you will never take your life with suicide. But it is a possibility of entering into hope and freedom.
So why does he call the travelers friends?
Well, friends. I mean, I grew up and I had people in my life that I thought were my friends, but they didn't think the same thing about me. I was so wanting companionship and community, and I didn't even recognize that these people were very dark and unhealthy for my life. And I called them my friends because I didn't have anybody else. And so I had to learn through some serious life changing events where I almost died several times that these people were not my friends and that they were not healthy for me. But I thought they were at the time, and I had to learn the lesson.
Hmm. Yeah, but I believe almost everybody had that kind of experience.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you're young, like we don't really know
We
what's
didn't know
good. Yeah,
better.
what's good or
Yeah.
bad. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the next question, what does the meat represent? So it was kind of tasty, I guess, in the beginning, right?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I know from law enforcement when someone takes a narcotic drug like meth or heroin or cocaine for the first time, it's an amazing experience. You get this incredible high. And yet, the second time around, you want to take the drug just to feel that initial high, and it's not the same, and you want more and more and more. And I think the meat represents the substance of that abuse,
Mm.
and that you want it, whether it be alcohol, drugs. It could be gambling, or it could be many different things. It's very multifaceted of what it could be, and like the story told us, you take that meat and you give away your gold,
Right. Mm.
and it's not like physical gold necessarily. I mean, it could be real money.
Hmm.
You could be a gambler and lose money,
Right.
or you could be paying for drugs or alcohol or whatever it is. But it is your treasure. It is your dignity. It is the thing that's in your heart that you give away in exchange for something that's going to produce what you think is going to be satisfying, but it isn't. It leaves
Yeah,
you.
like a time or a
Mm-hmm.
health and other stuff that, it's a
Right.
treasure to you,
And
but
it
yeah.
leaves you in a pit. That's where he was, and then they abandoned him.
Yeah. Yeah. So can you talk about how the man felt when the king arrived? So, the king arrived here. Do you think he was waiting for the king, or do you think he actually was even thinking that there's a king actually going to show up here? Or the helper is going to show up here?
Well, let's not forget he cried out.
Okay.
He cried out. So he was in darkness. He couldn't see the stars, and he lay down and he's crying and sobbing, and his pain of his wound and agreements surfaced in his heart. And then he could see the stars, and the stars provided guidance. The stars were the constellation. He was getting a sense of perspective, of guidance. And then the king came. And I think that when you truly cry out, help is on the way. I really believe that. And I think that how did he feel when the king arrived? Well, I'll give you an example. Just recently, we were in Montana driving home, and I was going too fast on the highway. And a state trooper pulled me over. And we grabbed all of our papers and my ID. And the trooper said, hello. And I said, sir, I was going too fast.
5 miles. 5 miles
75
over.
miles an hour. 5 miles over. And I said, I was heading to a town to go shopping. Well, he took our information, and we're thinking in the car, we're going to get a pretty big ticket here. And he comes back a couple minutes later, and he goes, have a nice day. I'm giving you a warning. And we didn't get a ticket. And we experienced mercy. And we were like talking about it for the rest of the drive home, like how grateful we are that we didn't get a ticket. We got mercy. We weren't given what we deserved or what I deserved. And I think that was such a relief. And so when it comes to this man meeting the king, it's the same thing. He could have been executed. He was a peasant. He was someone who screwed up and did something wrong. And yet the story tells us he loved him. And I think that's beautiful. And that's what we need, is that I've blown it many times on all sorts of things. And I've been granted mercy by Alisha for my mistakes, or by my parents, or my boss, or all sorts of people. And, they could kill us, figuratively, or literally, whatever. And I think that there's that fear of being confronted. I think there's a shame. He was faced with his shame. He's standing in front of royalty, and yet he didn't see himself correctly, right? So, yeah.
So I learned from the story now that you have to cry out, then King showed up.
Yes.
So you have to decide that I want to be done here, or meaning is get out of here and then go have a different life. Then help is showing up.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that makes sense, because mentally you're probably going to be ready to receive any advice or any help from others at that time, not before. Because before you may not even aware of what you're in or what kind of situation you're in. So, okay, that makes sense. And then the next question is, what is the significance between the sweet water and the bitter water?
Well, the wells and their water represent choice. And one kind of water is bitter, and so if you drink from that well, it's like eating the meat. And then the sweet well is sweet water, and it is rich and life-giving. And I think that the significance of those two is we all have a choice in life, and it depends on where we're going to drink from and what we choose not to drink from at the same time.
So why are those two waters, the levels are different?
The wells? Yeah. So the bitter well is, you drop the flask or the container deep down and it splashes far away. And then the other well, the sweet water, it's like the splash is right there. I think that it symbolizes that the bitter water well is empty. It doesn't have much for it. It doesn't have much value for it. And yet it's still death and destructive. But the good water is abundant. And that if you drink from that life, you will have more abundance and more riches and more significance of healing and things like that. And I think that it represents the value of each well.
The king restored the man and he calls him son. Why?
Well, it's interesting in this story that we hear about the main character as a man. But it isn't until the king shows up that we refer to him as son. And so I think that with the king represents a father to this orphaned man. this abandoned man. And when the king shows up, he automatically is treated as if he's a son. And when you're a son of a king, you're royalty as well. And I think that when you're dealing with addiction or bondage or shame of some kind, and you don't see yourself as royalty, there needs to be a shift where you begin to see, I am loved, and I am worthwhile, and I am good, and that I have good things about me, and that I'm loved. And so I think it's simply the king restores the son because it's his kid. He loves him, and even though it's so blatantly on his face, before that he didn't have that king. He didn't have that father, and so when it comes to the place of being adopted, you go on Google and you search images, right, of pet adoption, like the before and after of a dog at a kennel, and then the before he's all sad and lonely and depressed. You can see the expression on the dog's face and the dog's eyes. But man, once that owner shows up and says, I picked you, you're mine, and I'm going to bring you home to my castle, that dog's face is so full of life. And you see the videos, they're walking down the hallway and they're like, hey man, I have been adopted. I am my owner's dog. And that whole brightness of joy returns. And I think that that's what's happening here. I think that's the brilliance of what this story talks about, is that this man becomes a son, and he goes from a place of shame and brokenness and addiction. He didn't have clothes. He just had his pants. His shirt was ripped off of him and shredded by his former father. And yet now they put a crown on him. They put a royal robe. They put jewel-encrusted slippers on him. I mean, he's a completely transformed man into a son. I think that's beautiful. And he got free. And remember, the king cut the knife, but then he reminded him of the choice he has. And he whispers, stay away from the travelers. So you can be set free, right? And you can be given a sense of healing. But it's important to drink from the water of the sweet well and stay away from the travelers, if that makes any sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, travelers' troubles.
Travelers' troubles. Right. Cool. Well, thank you very much for asking me all these questions. Mm-hmm. Before we move on, do you have any thoughts or follow-up that you have for me?
Well,
or for yourself?
So it's been 2 days. We adopted another bunny, so now we have two
bunnies.
Yeah, bunnies.
Yeah.
And I can tell those two bunnies, their behaviors are way different still. And the adopted bunny, it's always stay in under the bed or in the box,
right? And
still a little scared of us and not eating from our hand yet. But our bunny who has been living with us 1.5 years, she just dominant everywhere. She's okay. She's follow us. She's eating everything we give mm-hmm. her, or we give some vegetable to two bunnies, but our pet bunny ate all. And the adopted bunny is still like adjusting the house. So that's probably the same thing that when you mentioned the dog getting adopted, they're like smiling. Mm-hmm. And then we will see the differences pretty soon from our second bunny. And then so I can literally experience the story in the house now.
That's cool. Mm-hmm. So if you find this story encouraging and empowering, and you want to have your own story, it will be completely different and unique, and you want to become a legend. All these stories have been written for real people, children and adults, young and old, men and women, and so many people, when they find out the power of having your own story, oh my God, they'll jump on it. So today, we're starting a new promotion. And so if you go to legendsofthewind.com and go to our store, there's 5 free slots open for a story. and you don't have to pay for it. Typically, it'll cost $250, and that's our gift to you. But we want you to have the opportunity to get your own story. The only stipulation is that when you sign up to do it, you're going to be a guest on my show here on the podcast, and I'm going to deliver it to you. I'm not going to interview you. I'm not going to research you. If I happen to know you, that's okay, but I'm not going to have any influence in the story. And then you get to I will deliver it to you live for the very first time on the show. And I've done this many, many times. I've never bombed. And by the way, I still get scared of bombing, even now. Sometimes the stories are so rich and so detailed, and it may deal with some heavy things, but it always works out for the benefit of the viewer and for you as the person receiving the story. So if you go on the description below here on YouTube, you can see a link, or you can go to legendsofthewind.com, and those 5 free stories are available right now. So we want to thank you for watching us. This show is now weekly, so every Monday night at 7 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Mountain, Monday nights, we'll be here, and we'll have more stories to share with you, and we're looking forward to writing more stories and delivering them to you, where you get to become a legend. If you want to email us, you can find us at support@legendsofthewind.com. Please don't forget to hit the like button on this video, hit subscribe, and hit the bell button, and thank you so much for watching our show. Thanks, Alisha.
Yeah, thank you.
Good questions. Mm-hmm. I'm glad that we got to have this great conversation. I've never really been able to express the story of the 2 wells this way in much detail, even though it's been stirring in my heart for a long time. Mm-hmm. So, thank you so much, guys.
Oh, before we go, I just want to say thank you, Kylie, our daughter, who is watching us right now, and she asked us to mention her name, so I did.
Cool. Well, thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kylie. We love you. And thank you for watching us tonight. And we'll see you soon. Have a good night. Bye-bye.